excerpt from a newspaper article in the Chicago Tribune from 2015.
Yes. I'm just going to read a portion of the article, which was very interesting. The state-by-state decriminalization wave follows a push for tougher laws that began in 1971, when then-President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. Mandatory minimum sentences went into effect in the late 1980s. A decade later, the collateral consequences, such as the disproportionate effect on African Americans, became clear. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the federal prison population ballooned from nearly 25,000 in 1980 to more than 219,000 in 2013. Recidivism also escalated, as criminal records prevented many offenders from securing employment and housing. In 2002, the Unitarian Universalist Association became the first religious denomination to adopt a statement of conscience, calling for an end to the nation's war on drugs and the legalization and regulation of marijuana. While no other denomination has called for such a radical policy change, many others, including the United Methodist Church, the Union for Reform Judaism, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and the Episcopal Church, support the controlled use of marijuana for medical reasons. It's a bigger issue than just making marijuana legal, said the Reverend Tom Capo, pastor of the DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church in Naperville, Illinois. My position is that it's more important for us to be healing these people. My hope is that we do reach a point to say that marijuana is no longer a controlled substance, and understand that instead of putting people in prison, we need to offer them assistance, counseling, drug rehab, so they can put their lives back together, Capo said. Putting them in prison does not stop people from using drugs. It just isolates them from the rest of the society. The Reverend Al Sharp, who was ordained by the United Church of Christ and founder of the group called Clergy for a New Drug Policy, said he recognizes that the Unitarian Universalists were ahead of their time. Part of my mission is to say to the Unitarians, I'm here to help you implement your own policy. And clergy are stepping up to that. Reverend Tom Campo goes on to say, I certainly realize there is going to be a lot of change in the way we deal with drugs in our society. For me, this is a social justice issue.
Thank you. Now we have the pleasure of introducing our major speaker today. It's Jay Selthofner. And he's accompanied here today by Richard Martins, who is the executive director of the Northern Wisconsin NORML. And Jay is a long-standing activist, and you can see in your program I've included a more detailed explanation of his background. And Jay probably be telling you something about that too. Jay, it sure does look like marijuana. Maybe you can explain.
You shut that one off. Thanks, Scott. Just do the microphone check real quick. Everybody can hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Thank you again for allowing me to speak this morning. It's always a great honor to talk about marijuana reform and cannabis in specific. When Scott first approached me, and I looked over the sermon, and part of it was offering reflections upon cannabis reform. Scott mentioned I've been doing this for quite some time now. 2009 is when I first got active, and the first reflection I made was upon myself and why did I get active? I've been doing this for quite some time now. A lot of people don't ask that question anymore. And so I kind of asked it to myself, and I'm going to share with you a quick story. One Sunday morning, I was watching a news program, and a lady from California shared her story. And I've known about marijuana, industrial hemp, medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, but the story that she shared, moved me so much that I wept. And I'm not a crier or anything like that, but I just wept. And it was just a 5-minute news story on Good Morning America or the CBS morning show. But her story was so moving, and it hit me personally because I knew other families who were going through the same circumstance that she was. And her circumstance was that she had a child who was severely ill, was inflicted with autism. She lived in California, which had a medical marijuana law or a compassionate use law. So, that caught my interest right away. Oh, marijuana. At that time, we were talking about marijuana reform. A lot of the opposition was talking about, how would this affect children? What message are we sending to our kids? Will it increase, juvenile usage? So her story, resonated with me right away. And she had a child who, throughout a long period of time, had numerous amounts of medications piled on her, and really was given a death sentence. That the doctors told her that the child was not even a candidate for a feeding tube, and left the room. So that really gave this child a death sentence. So the mother, again, because she was in California, they did have a compassionate use law, and it did allow juveniles to be treated. So she began doing her own independent research and found some protocols about how medical marijuana or cannabis, infused in some sort of edible product and then given to the child in unison with weaning them off these drugs that were meant to help fight the autism. So now, she had been doing this some time, and her story wasn't new, like she just started treating her child, but she treated her child. Her child recovered. Her child was taken off several different medications and basically began putting on weight. Now, every autism spectrum is a little bit different, but this was a nonverbal, non-communicating child. After they used marijuana in corporation with their regular medical treatment, this child actually began having verbal skills, and I'm not going to say recover from autism, but it's a night and day difference. He's not on a death sentence. It's 10 years later, he's healthy, he's putting on weight. So the story itself moved me. We had family members, family friends who had a child who was very much in the same similar circumstance, but in a non-legal state. This child was actually institutionalized and taken away from their family. So, pulling on my heartstrings and emotions over here and learning about it here, it just dawned on me, I need to do something. I have the ability to speak out about this. We have industrial hemp here that's growing wild around my farm where I live in Green Lake. At the same time I'm watching this news report, I see wild hemp growing right in front of me, even after the county had an eradication program, was paid by the federal government for decades to try to eradicate this plant. There it is, popping up everywhere again and again and again. So it just felt like the right time for me to speak out about cannabis reform. As I travel to different places and talk to different people, everybody has, their own personal story about marijuana, especially in Wisconsin. Whether it had been, I remember when my grandfather grew industrial hemp during the war, or maybe they were excused from military duty because they were a farmer growing hemp, and hemp was very vital to the war. We've got to remember that California went legal with medical marijuana in 1996. So we've had people who've grown up in Wisconsin, graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and migrated to California and participated in the medical marijuana program. They'll come back home and visit family, and they'll share with us the different stories about how marijuana reform affects their states. Now we have more than just medical marijuana out there. We have recreational cannabis too, which some states have restrictions on the ailments that can be treated with medical marijuana. So in these recreational states, it's also opened up additional, basically patient resources, because they no longer need the medical diagnosis to treat their specific condition with cannabis. In thinking about this again, and examining my own activism and where we were, in 2009 to where we are today, and just recently, our 2018 elections, we saw a couple more states go legal. That would be recreational cannabis. But the statistic that stuck out, and I'm not a guy who throws a bunch of numbers at people, because those numbers do change from time to time, but right now, and this is a reflection, kind of an aha that it came to me in preparing for this, that right now, about 60% of our population lives in a place that has access to legal marijuana. Obviously the United States has a population disparagement. There's heavy population densities here and there. But with the 29 medical states and 8 states that have some sort of compassionate use law, 60% of citizens in the United States population have access to legal marijuana, plus the Washington D.C. So, of the 30 states or 29 states that have medical marijuana laws, there's about 20 of them that have operational dispensaries, and those would be what we would consider storefronts, where patients can just come in, show some sort of ID, show some sort of proof that they can have that marijuana and have access to it. Of the legal states that are recreational or adult usage, sometimes those terms get synonymous with each other. Of those 8 states, 4 of those states actually have retail stores also, where anybody at a certain age from any state can walk into a store and purchase marijuana. Now, I think one reason that you don't have a packed crowd today is that marijuana is pretty much socially acceptable in the United States now. It's no longer a controversial issue. When I first got active and when I was talking to elected officials and even talking to the general public, even at that time, the public was way ahead of policymakers when it comes to marijuana reform. And we have to look back at history and try to figure out why is that? And if we really look at not even history, but prehistory, the cannabis plant itself has been used as a source of, either fiber, food, or some sort of fuel since antiquity. The Roman aqueducts have traces of hemp concrete that was used to hold them together. So cannabis has been used since antiquity. It's just now growing to include that recreational use and some say spiritual use also. Now, everybody's at a different level of their cannabis education when I'm dealing with the general public, so I kind of just like to take through some general terminologies also. Today, when we use the word marijuana, what we're really describing is the flower of the cannabis plant, or products derived from the flower of the cannabis plant. Now, marijuana, recreational or medical, can be smoked. And that's, I think, what most common people think about using marijuana, but it can be vaporized, it can be eaten, it can be taken in many different forms. When it is inhaled, though, as opposed to ingesting, one can help control your dosage, if you want to say. So the reason I bring this up is there's a lot of states that have medical marijuana laws and compassionate use laws, but they don't allow smoking, or smokable products. So it's important when us as activists and us in the general public, when we're talking to people about what sort of cannabis reform policies are going to be put in place. You know, when the rubber hits the road, are the laws our legislators enacting, you know, going to make the most sense and going to be the best for our general public? Now, smoking cigarettes kills people every year. It's one of the largest killers. Despite conventional belief, the marijuana and marijuana smoke itself is non-toxic, and it's actually non-toxic, and it's non-intoxicating. On the drug scale, we would consider it psychoactive and most similar to caffeine. THC, which is the main component in marijuana, or the drug component of it, it's the euphoric feeling, the one that gives you the high. It doesn't react to your brainstem. It doesn't attach itself to your brainstem. So when it comes to marijuana or THC, it is impossible to overdose on it. And that's a big misconception that a lot of people don't know. They say, especially when they look at where Congress has it labeled as far as a drug in the scale of drug forms. But it is non-toxic. It doesn't react to your brainstem. It doesn't bind to your brainstem. It is impossible to overdose on it. And since marijuana has been used since history, there's been no recorded death or overdose from marijuana. Again, I mentioned THC. That's the principal ingredient in marijuana. Again, it has a long name. The technical name for it is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. When I talk to medical people and talk to patients, the biggest reason or treatments from it is to relieve pain, help with anxiety, fears, and other discomforts. Medically, it's been proven to help with Crohn's, cancer patients, both with the combating the effects of the chemo and radiations and the anti-nausea properties, but also in directly fighting their cancers. The benefits of marijuana, which is another argument for legalization, is going to vary from strain to potency to, it is an agricultural product, so the environment it is growing in. And again, that's what's very important about having a regulated market. Even in states that don't have any form of compassionate use law or any form of recreational marijuana. In states that it's totally illegal to use marijuana, people are still using it, you know, whether it's medically or recreationally. Not that that's a public safety danger in itself, because we learned already that even in an uncontrolled, unregulated market that has existed since time, no one's died from marijuana. But nonetheless, when people are, especially medical patients, when they're trying to treat their symptoms, their ailments, their disease, consistency is a very important thing. And removing any criminal element from it or removing it from the black market allows those types of things to be more consistent for patients. Again, I think the public policy is way ahead of our politicians. So as far as activism goes, how do we get our elected officials to take notice of this issue, to own it, to talk about it, to have the conversations with their constituents? I think it's a challenge that we face no matter what the issue is, let alone marijuana. And our elected officials are probably bombarded by special interests. They probably have multiple lines of communications coming from constituents on all different matters. Marijuana reform is just like any other issue now, you know, so we don't need to be afraid of it. We don't need to necessarily endorse it or use it to talk about cannabis reform with our elected officials. What we just need to do is not be afraid to talk about it, to just open up that dialogue, that we each have a little bit to give, we each have a little bit to learn, and you know, through not being afraid, through having an open dialogue, the conversation is going to continue, the conversation is going to grow, and at some point, Wisconsin's public policy or elected officials will catch up with public policy, and we'll see some reform in Wisconsin. Now, Scott also asked me to share with you a little bit about what has happened in Wisconsin politically on the issue of cannabis reform. Now, without spending a great deal of time on the political process of how a bill becomes law, we all know there's a procedure involved in that. Yep, and if there is, I was gonna say, I think on the back of your program today, there is a list of all active legislation out there. Real briefly, the legislation doesn't cover industrial hemp, which would basically an agricultural product which would allow farmers to grow acres of this stuff and turn it into a food, fuel, or fiber product. I live in a farming community, and that's also a difficult choice that I have, looking at the couple hundred acres around my farm, saying, what's the most important commodity of this industrial hemp product? Is it food? When this plant flowers out and it produces a seed, the seed itself is a very, very nutritious seed. It has omega and amino acids. Glucosteins, I believe is how you pronounce it. It's found in our blood. So the hemp nut itself is a product that could sustain life if we needed it to. Source of amino acids, proteins, omega-3s. But again, when I look at that product, I say, is feeding our world the most important thing? That same seed can be pressed into a biodiesel fuel. So looking around and say, okay, we have an issue where nutrition is important, but fuel is important too. The crop grows